The Canadian Wheat Board and its influence on the Canadian wheat industry. The Canadian wheat industry has been extremely successful in international exports for a number of years. Canada is one of the largest exporters of wheat worldwide, having exported over 18 million tons in 2018. Despite the success of the industry, it has seen a number of controversies around how Canadian wheat is marketed, priced, and sold at the international level. From 1935 to 2012, the Canadian Wheat Board, or CWB, was the single selling desk for Canadian grain. Essentially, Canadian farmers could not sell their wheat to anyone other than the CWB, who in turn controlled all international selling and exportation of Canada's wheat. In 2012, it was shut down and sold to a foreign marketing agribusiness. The CWB was created largely because of the need to implement wartime measures and protect farmers from volatile market fluctuations. The government originally established the CWB post-World War I in 1919. However, the board ceased operations the following year. It did not form again until 1935, when prairie farmers pushed for a central selling agency that offered alternatives to farmers when the free market opened again. After the outbreak of World War II, the CWB was made the mandatory monopoly marketer for prairie wheat. This is truly when the CWB gained control of the wheat industry in Canada. At its peak, the CWB was marketing over 30 million tons of wheat and barley on behalf of Western farmers. How it worked was essentially the CWB would estimate how much farmers will receive for their grain. They would then buy the grain from farmers at around 70 to 75% of what they guess the final price would be. Next, the CWB markets and sells the grains to international and domestic buyers, with any surplus and revenues from the original buying point being returned to farmers. The single desk selling power ensured that if any exporter wanted Canadian wheat, they had to buy it from the CWB, which could potentially charge a higher price than if the market were competitive. Because of its single desk selling authority, there was a lot of criticism that came with how the CWB operated, both from international buyers and from competitors, and as well as Canadian farmers themselves. One of the main criticisms was the price pooling system that they used. So essentially, the CWB used a price pooling system in which the objective was to average the market value of a crop over the course of a certain period of time, as opposed to using the fluctuating daily price of a crop. Price pool returns, which is the money returned to farmers after the wheat is bought, is the combined revenue from all sales minus operating costs. Farmers would receive a pooled price for their grain that depends upon the class, grade, and protein of the grain delivered. There were many farmers who did not see the price pooling scheme as beneficial, and many even risked breaking federal law to market their own wheat to American customers because they thought they could potentially get a better price. There were also complaints from the World Trade Organization. So in 2004, the WTO had a problem with the CWB's price pooling scheme, and the Canadian government's role in funding that. So on occasion that the pool goes into deficit, the federal government was guaranteed to pay the CWB that amount, which the WTO wanted that guaranteed deficit agreement to be removed. There was also some complaints that the CWB was using marketing techniques that weren't necessary. So that was costing farmers money, and farmers were saying the CWB was adding unnecessary costs rather than actually trying to market wheat competitively. The CWB has also been accused of unfair trading practices by the U.S. a total of 12 times. One of the most notable accusations was in 2003 when the U.S. Department of Commerce initiated countervailing and anti-dumping investigations on imports of Canadian wheat. and the CWB was found guilty of this, and certain duties and anti-dumping taxes were imposed on certain types of wheat. So in 2012 came the end of the CWB's single desk selling powers. Some have dubbed this one of Canada's largest economic tragedies. Others have claimed it to be an act of freedom for farmers. In 2012, Prime Minister Stephen Harper announced the Marketing Freedom for Grains Act, which essentially gave Western Canadian grain farmers the freedom to choose when they sell, who they sell to, and how much they sell for. So basically, they no longer had to only sell to the CWB. The CWB became a voluntary marketing organization that farmers could still use, but it was not mandatory. In July 2015, the CWB was bought by G3 Global Grain Group, a business owned by Bunge Canada and Salak Canada, two very large agribusinesses. All the assets and money in the CWB, which legally belonged to Canadian farmers, were actually transferred to these foreign-owned companies. And many farmers have gone to court asking $7 billion in total damages that belonged to farmers and were transferred to the foreign owners. And to this day, farmers in the prairies are still trying to get the money that was rightfully theirs. So, since the loss of the CWB, there has been a major change in the way wheat is marketed and sold in Canada, and there are many reports that state that the loss of the CWB has resulted in increasingly dysfunctional rail system, no grain logistics oversight, a loss of transport efficiency on land, by rail, and at sea, reduced grain quality guarantees to other nations, and overall just a loss of billions of dollars to farmers in their communities, which had a devastating impact on the prairie economy and jobs lost, rural spending, and trade balance, which ultimately affects all of Canada. That being said, there are some farmers who said the CWB held them hostage, and the freedom to market helps increase a farmer's control over their crops and profits. And despite mixed reviews from farmers, the impact the CWB has had on the Canadian wheat industry from its creation to its end is really just a reflection of the struggles of the industrial food system and kind of where we're heading. It shows the direct impact a government can have on farmers' livelihood and well-being, forcing them to use systems they may not want to, and then dismantling those systems just as fast. With the CWB and its assets being transferred to a corporation, it shows the power shift from farmers to corporate powers that is happening all over the food system. So kind of that takeover from local small-scale farmers to large-scale agri-corporations. In total, Canadian farmers have lost more than $7 billion in reduced sales and pricing of grain since the CWB was dismantled. Many also claim that though it was a conservative government that dismantled the CWB, the Liberals have done nothing to support wheat farmers, even though they said they would. As of right now, millions of dollars have still not been returned to the farmers, and they remain in G3's possession. This is representative of a farming system that prioritizes profits at farmers' expenses. Based on neoliberal and capitalist ideals, the corporatization of one of Canada's largest agricultural organizations reflects the values of a food system that intends to solely maximize profits rather than protect farmers. The success and demise of the CWB shows the power of government and policy when it comes to farming, and ultimately how the industrial food system, rooted in neoliberal values, will always take control from small-scale farmers in order to maximize profits and trades.